The first thing she saw was the war paint black and crimson, streaks glowing in the moonlight just before the butt of his rifle smashed into the ground beside her head. The crack of wood on rock echoed through the canyon like a warning shot. She froze where she crouched in the brittle grass, chest heaving, heart slamming against her ribs like it wanted out. The desert air was sharp and dry, clawing at her lungs. Every breath tasted of dust and copper. Somewhere above, the jagged canyon walls reached for the stars, casting black shadows that swallowed all but the faint silver gleam of the moon. Hoofbeats thundered in the distance, getting louder, dozens of them, until the ground itself trembled. The smell of horse sweat, leather, and burnt powder filled the gorge. Coyotes wailed somewhere beyond the ridges, their thin cries swallowed by the echo of hooves. She'd been running for hours. Her boots were torn, her skirt ripped from scrambling. Over rocks, her lips cracked so badly she tasted blood. The lantern light from the posse had vanished behind her nearly an hour ago, leaving her alone in this hollow of stone and silence. And then he appeared. He stood no more than 10 feet away, motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Tall, broad-shouldered, his silhouette was carved against the pale sky like a statue that had stepped down from its pedestal. His hair, black as tar, was bound at the nape with a strip of rawhide. Feathers and bone beads hung from it, swaying faintly in the night breeze. His chest was bare but for a bandolier of brass cartridges slung across him, the gleam of them catching stray moonlight. His eyes were the kind you didn't forget, hard, steady, and ancient somehow. They didn't burn with rage or cruelty the way she'd heard about in tavern stories. They were worse, calm, calculating, and heavy with the weight of something she couldn't yet name. "You come?" he said, voice deep and low, the words edged with an accent but impossible to misunderstand. He reached out, gripping her arm in a way that was firm without being frantic, as if he'd already decided she had no choice. She thought about fighting. Her nails curled into her palms, ready to scratch, her muscles coiled to run. But even as she glanced toward the shadows behind her, she saw them 5, maybe 6 more riders, dark outlines against the ridge. Their rifles glinted faintly in the moonlight. She had nowhere to go. The stories rushed into her mind. Some called him the Painted Gorge Warrior, others whispered his real name in half-remembered fear. A man who struck supply wagons, raided army patrols, and left behind the kind of silence that comes only after blood has been spilled. She had heard he took no prisoners unless they were worth trading. And now she was in his grip. He turned without another word, pulling her toward the deeper shadows of the gorge. The dust crunched beneath their boots. The walls closed in on either side, blotting out the night sky until only a narrow ribbon of stars remained overhead. Her legs screamed from exhaustion, but his stride never faltered. Somewhere far beyond the ridge behind them, lights flickered. Search party. She could almost hear her name being called in the distance, but the warrior didn't look back. He didn't even slow. His hand was steady on her arm, guiding her like she was a pack mule instead of a person. They passed into a cleft in the rock where the air turned cold, smelling faintly of damp earth. She could hear the distant hiss of water, maybe a spring or underground stream. The hoofbeats of his men echoed differently here, bouncing back in strange ways that made it impossible to count them. She tried to speak, to demand why he'd taken her, but before the words formed, he stopped. They were standing before a natural wall of stone, split by a narrow path barely wide enough for a single person. He looked down at her, and for the first time she saw something shift in his expression. Not pity, not threat, something else, a measure. As if he were deciding if she could survive what waited beyond. Without warning, he pushed her forward into the dark gap. It was only then she realized the truth. Whatever danger lay behind her was nothing compared to what he was leading her toward. The gap in the stone was so narrow she had to turn sideways to pass through. Her shoulder scraped the cold rock, and each step swallowed more light until the only glow came from a faint orange flicker ahead. The air inside was cooler, tinged with smoke and the metallic scent of wet stone. When the path widened, she found herself staring down into a hollow, unnatural bowl in the canyon floor. Fires burned in pits ringed by stones. Dark shapes moved around them, men sharpening blades, tying down restless horses, boiling something in blackened pots that sent up greasy smoke. The warrior didn't slow as he guided her down a narrow slope toward the largest fire. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. If the posse from town had frightened her, this silence chilled her more. These men didn't look curious, they looked hungry. Some had painted faces. Others wore coats stolen from soldiers, buttons hanging loose. Most carried rifles or bows. A few leaned on long knives with edges that caught the firelight. A tall warrior with a jagged scar across his cheek stepped forward. His hair was bound tight and adorned with eagle feathers. His eyes moved from her to the man holding her. He said something sharp and fast in their language. The others murmured, some nodding, some spitting into the dirt. She didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. They didn't want her here. The man who had taken her warrior, though she hated to think of him that way, answered in the same tongue. His voice stayed low but firm. The scarred man's mouth twisted in a smile that wasn't friendly. He stepped closer, too close, his gaze crawling over her like a snake over a rock. Without warning, her captor moved between them, his broad shoulders blocking her from view. The movement was casual, almost lazy, but his hand rested lightly on the hilt of a long knife at his waist. The scarred man's smile faded. He spat once, muttered something, and backed away. The murmuring stopped, replaced by the hiss and pop of the fire. The warrior led her to the far side of the hollow, where a rough shelter had been built from stretched hides and cedar poles. He motioned for her to sit on a rolled blanket. She hesitated. "You." "Stay," he said, pointing to the ground. Then he turned and walked toward the central fire, where a cluster of older men waited. She pulled her knees up, trying to shrink into the shadows. From where she sat, she could see him speaking with the elders. His voice was steady, but his hands moved as he talked, sometimes pointing at her, sometimes toward the canyon beyond. She didn't need to hear the words to know he was arguing for something in losing. One of the elders shook his head, his long gray braids swinging. Another leaned forward and said something that made the others laugh, a short, humorless sound. The warrior's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. They left him standing there. When he returned, his expression was carved from stone. He crouched before her, eyes level with hers. "You listen," he said. "This camp many want you dead. They think you bring trouble. Army, town guns. Kill you, no trouble." Her stomach nodded. "Then why haven't they?" "Because I say no." His tone cut her short. "You live. For now." He rose, glanced over his shoulder toward the scarred man who was watching from across the fire, and added quietly, "But you stay close. No run, no talk to others. Understand?" She nodded. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat in the darkness, the crackle of distant fires mixing with the whisper of knives being sharpened. More than once, she saw shadows shift at the edge of the camp, someone lingering too long before disappearing into the dark. She realized then that the warrior hadn't just captured her, he had claimed her. Not in the way of ownership, but in the way a man stakes a line in the dirt and dares anyone to cross it. And in this camp of knives, that line was the only thing keeping her alive. But for how long, she didn't know. She woke to the sound of leather scraping on stone. The campfires had burned down to embers, throwing long, broken shadows across the canyon floor. The warrior's shelter smelled faintly of smoke, horse, and the dry musk of animal hides. For a moment she thought she'd dreamed it until the shape moved again. Just beyond the thin flap of hide that served as a doorway, she held her breath. The figure was crouched low, silhouetted against the dim glow of dying coals. One hand gripped a long knife, the blade dull and dark so it wouldn't catch the light. Her first instinct was to call out for the warrior, but her voice stuck in her throat. She didn't even know if he was here. He'd left hours ago to speak again with the elders. For all she knew, she was alone. The flap shifted. A hand reached inside. Before the figure could move further, something happened so fast she barely registered it. The flap burst open, and the warrior was suddenly there, one arm hooking the attacker's neck, the other wrenching the knife hand back until the blade clattered to the ground. The two men struggled in the dirt. The attacker, a broad-shouldered man with painted cheeks, snarled in their language, spitting curses. The warrior didn't answer. His grip tightened until the man's legs kicked weakly, then stopped. He released him with a shove, sending him sprawling into the dust. A few other warriors had risen from their blankets, watching from the edges of the firelight. No one stepped forward to help. No one said a word. The attacker staggered to his feet, glaring at the woman before spitting at the warrior's feet. Then he turned and melted into the shadows beyond the fires. The warrior bent, picked up the fallen knife, and examined the edge. His expression didn't change, but there was a coldness in his eyes now that hadn't been there before. "You stay inside," he said, his voice low but carrying a sharp edge. "Do not move from here unless I come." She wanted to demand an explanation, why someone had just tried to kill her, why no one seemed surprised, but the look on his face kept her silent. When he left, she sat in the darkness, listening to the camp breathe, the hiss of cooling stones, the occasional snort of a horse, the shuffle of boots on dirt. But beneath it all, she sensed something else, tension. Like a bowstring pulled too tight. Near dawn, he returned. His hair was damp from the cold mist that clung to the canyon floor, and his bare chest glistened faintly in the dim light. He tossed something to the ground near her feet. It was a small leather pouch. "Eat," he said. Inside were strips of smoked meat and a few dried berries. She ate slowly, her hands trembling. Finally, she spoke. "Why are they trying to kill me? I didn't do anything." He crouched, his gaze level with hers. "Not matter what you do. You are from town. You are proof." "Proof of what?" she asked. "That I break rules," he said simply. The words sank in like stones dropped into a well. She understood now. By taking her, he had defied someone powerful in this camp. Maybe the elders, maybe a council of warriors. Whatever it was, the rules had been broken, and her existence here was a challenge to their authority. Why not just let them have me then? She asked. His eyes darkened. "Because they would kill you slow, and because you know things. Town things, army things, things they will try to take from you." She shook her head. "I don't know anything important." "They will think you do," he said. Then, after a pause, "and the army will come for you. And they will come through here. Kill many. That is why I keep you alive for now." His words weren't a comfort, but they were the truth. She could see it in his face. She wasn't being protected out of kindness. She was being used as a pawn in a game she didn't understand yet. As the first light of day crept over the canyon walls, the warrior stood and slung his rifle across his back. "Today we move. Camp. Too many eyes here." And as she followed him out into the pale dawn, she realized that too many eyes didn't just mean the warriors. It meant something else, eyes from outside the canyon, eyes that would soon make the ground between her town and this camp runward. They broke camp before the sun cleared the canyon rim. The fires were stamped out until nothing but blackened stones remained. Horses were saddled in silence, the metallic jangle of bits and stirrups echoing off the rock. The woman kept to the edge of the group, watched closely by the warrior. He didn't speak to her as he handed her a skin of water and a small bundle of food. His war paint was fresh, 2 black lines across his cheeks, a streak of crimson down his forehead. It made his expression unreadable, like he was already thinking of the fights ahead. They moved quickly through the gorge, single file. The ground was loose and treacherous, dotted with thorn bushes that clawed at her torn clothing. The canyon walls slowly gave way to rolling desert hills, open and exposed. She felt the sun's heat rising, though it was still early. Twice the warrior lifted his hand, halting the group. He'd scanned the horizon, head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. Each time, they moved on without explanation. By midday, they reached a dry riverbed. The group paused to water the horses at a narrow trickle that still ran through the sand. That's when she saw them, 3 riders on a distant ridge, tiny black figures against the pale sky. They weren't moving toward the camp, but they were watching. The warrior noticed them too. His jaw tightened. He signaled to one of his men, who rode off in a wide arc, vanishing into the hills. "They're following us," she said quietly. He glanced at her, then away. "Not them only. Others behind them. Others behind those." "You mean the army?" His gaze stayed on the ridge. "Army comes. My people follow. Both want you." She swallowed hard. "Why? I told you I don't know anything." "Not matter." "What is true," he said. "They believe, and belief makes war." They pushed on, riding hard through the afternoon. Her legs ached from gripping the saddle, and the hot wind dried her throat until every swallow felt like sandpaper. By the time the sun began to sink, painting the desert in gold and crimson, they reached a stretch of scrubland broken by strange stone formations, tall, narrow spires rising from the earth like the fingers of some buried giant. The warrior called a halt in the shelter of the rocks. The men moved quickly, leading horses into the shadows and posting sentries on the higher ground. She sank to the ground, leaning against a warm boulder. The air was still, heavy with the scent of dry sage. Somewhere nearby, a hawk cried, sharp and lonely. The warrior approached, crouching beside her. "Tonight, no fire," he said. "Too easy for eyes to find us." She nodded, then hesitated. "You could just let me go. I could try to get back to town." "They wouldn't follow you then." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You not last one day alone out here. And if army catch you, they ask questions. You tell them you were here. That is enough." "I wouldn't tell them anything," she said. "Does not matter," he replied. "They will make you talk. That is their way." Before she could answer, a low whistle came from the rocks above. One of the sentries pointed toward the horizon where the last light was fading. She followed his gaze and her stomach dropped. A thin line of riders was moving across the plain toward them, silhouettes sharp against the orange sky. They were too far to make out details, but their formation was wrong for hunters or traders. It was military. The warrior rose to his full height, calling instructions in his own language. The camp came alive, warriors slipping into positions among the rocks, rifles ready. He looked down at her once. "Stay low. Do not run. If you run, they shoot you first." The riders drew closer, the thud of hooves carrying on the wind. Somewhere, in the deepening dark, another sound began to rise, the answering beat of hooves from behind them. They were trapped between 2 forces, and she realized the warrior had been right. All along, belief was about to make war, and she was at the center of it. The last streaks of sunset had barely faded when the first shot rang out. It came from the riders on the plain, sharp, flat, and fast. The bullet smacked into a rock just above her head, sending stone splinters into her hair. She dropped flat, the taste of dust filling her mouth. The warrior didn't flinch. He barked an order, and his men returned fire from their positions among the stone spires. The air was instantly alive with the crack of rifles and the echo of shots bouncing between the rocks. Then came the other sound hoofbeats from behind. The second force had arrived. They were closer than she expected, cresting the low ridge they had crossed hours earlier. Their horses were painted with white handprints and stripes, the riders' faces marked for war. She recognized some of them from the Painted Gorge camp. They weren't here to help Dot in the dying light. She saw the scarred warrior from before riding at their head, his eagle feathers streaming behind him. He raised a spear and shouted in their language, his voice carrying above the gunfire. She didn't know the words, but she knew the meaning. Kill them both. The warrior at her side cursed low, grabbed her by the arm, and pulled her deeper into the rock maze. Bullets smacked into the stone walls, sending sharp pings into the air. Somewhere to her left, one of his men cried out, the sound cut short by another shot. They reached a narrow cut between two boulders. He pushed her down behind one and dropped to a knee, working the lever of his rifle with smooth, deadly precision. Each time he fired, he shifted position before loading again, never staying in the same spot long enough to be an easy target. The gunfire from both sides intensified, and the space between the two forces shrank fast. She risked a glance over the rock and saw flashes of blue uniforms among the approaching riders on the plain. Army scouts leading the way for a larger force. The warrior saw it too. No time, he muttered. We break out. How? She asked, choking on dust. Through them. He pointed toward the scarred warriors group. That's suicide. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second. Better than waiting. To die. Before she could argue, he was on his feet, firing two quick shots toward the ridge. One rider tumbled from his horse. Another pulled back hard on his reins. Then the warrior grabbed her and ran, keeping low as they moved from rock to rock. The noise was deafening shouting, gunfire, the scream of frightened horses. Somewhere close, a bullet hit flesh, followed by the thud of a body hitting sand. They burst from the cover of the spires into open ground. The scarred warrior saw them instantly and spurred his horse forward, his men following. The warrior didn't. Slow. He veered toward a cluster of low hills where the shadow fell thickest, dragging her with him. The scarred man's spear whistled through the air, missing them by inches as it clattered into the dirt. A second later, the two men collided horse and man against man on foot. The warrior swung his rifle like a club, slamming the butt into the scarred man's ribs. The blow knocked him sideways in the saddle, but he recovered fast, drawing a knife. The woman stumbled back as the two warriors closed in on each other, blades flashing in the half-light. The fight was brutal, fast, and without words, just the grunt of impact and the ring of steel against steel. It ended with a single move. The warrior twisted the knife from his opponent's hand and drove his elbow into the scarred man's face. Blood sprayed, and the man toppled from his horse, hitting the ground hard. The warrior didn't finish him. He just grabbed the woman's arm and pulled her toward the hills. Behind them, the army's lead scouts broke through the gunfire, their shouts carrying in English now. Stop! Don't move! Neither of them stopped. They vanished into the darkness beyond the ridge, leaving two enemies behind and both still hunting them. The desert swallowed them whole. Once they crested the ridge, the night closed in, black and heavy, broken only by the faint silver wash of the moon. The gunfire faded behind them, replaced by the drumbeat of their own boots and the distant shouts of men still in pursuit. The warrior didn't speak. He moved fast, sure-footed even in the dark, pulling her along with a grip that allowed no argument. Her lungs burned, and each breath felt like she was swallowing dry sand. Behind them, faint lights bobbed in swayed lanterns, carried by riders who weren't giving up. They reached a stretch of jagged ground. where stone teeth jutted from the earth like the remains of some ancient monster. The warrior led her into it, weaving through narrow cuts and ledges so tight she had to turn sideways. The rock scraped her arms, and more than once she stumbled, skinning her knees. At one point, he stopped suddenly, pressing her back against the stone. She could feel his heartbeat, steady and slow, even though they'd been running for miles. He raised a hand for silence. The sound reached her a moment later, the faint creak of saddle, leather, and the dull clink of a canteen against metal. Someone was close, maybe just on the other side of the rocks. The warrior crouched low, his hand going to the knife at his belt. She held her breath, listening to the riders pass. Hoofbeats slowed, then stopped. A voice called out in English. They came this way. Her heart sank. That wasn't the scarred man's voice. That was the army. The warrior's eyes flicked toward her, sharp in the moonlight. Without a word, he moved again, keeping low and slipping between the rocks until they spilled out into a dry wash. The sand here was loose, muffling their steps, but it also made every movement slower. By the time they reached the far side, the lantern lights were closer. She could hear the faint jingle of bits and the occasional cough of a horse. Finally, they reached a patch of low scrub where he stopped and dropped to one knee. He pulled something from a pouch, a small, folded bundle, wrapped in deer hide. Opening it, he revealed a handful of small, flat stones painted with symbols in red ochre. He set them carefully on the ground in a pattern she didn't understand. Then he covered them again and tucked the bundle away. What was that? She whispered. His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. Mark for others. Tell them where we go. Others? You mean more of your people? He shook his head once. No, not my people. Then who? He didn't answer right away. People who want the same thing I do. Keep you alive. She frowned. Why? You keep saying I'm trouble. You keep saying I'm dangerous to have around. Why are you? He cut her off. Because you saw it. Saw what? The burning wagons. The soldiers dead on the trail. You saw it before they found you. Her mouth went dry. She had seen it just after she left town, a few miles from the old stage route. She hadn't told anyone, because she didn't know what she'd witnessed. That wasn't my people, he said. But the army says it is. They come for us. Take our land, kill our families. You tell them truth, maybe war stops, maybe not. But if you die here, their story wins. The words hit her like a cold wind. She realized then that she wasn't just some pawn in a tribal quarrel. She was the only living witness to something that could start a war. Before she could speak, the sound of hoofbeats grew louder again. The warrior rose, pulling her to her feet. We go now. They pushed on into the night, following a faint animal trail that wound through the sage. The moonlight flickered as clouds passed overhead, and the land seemed to shift and change with every step. Somewhere behind them, a coyote howled. Then another sound followed, distant, sharp, and unmistakable. A rifle shot. They weren't running fast enough. The first light of dawn touched the rim of Shadow Bluff, turning the jagged cliffs into a crown of fire. The air was brittle with cold, every breath turning to mist, but sweat already slicked Running Hawk's back. He stood on the high ledge with the woman crouched behind him, her hands bound but eyes locked on the path below. They'd been running all night, feet bleeding over stone and cactus, chased by men who didn't tire. Now there was no more running. Below, the riders appeared 15 men on horses, dust plumes trailing like ghost banners in the rising sun. Some wore blue coats of the U.S. cavalry, others wore the ragged gear of bounty hunters. All carried rifles. All wanted her back. The canyon walls amplified every hoofbeat, making the small group sound like an army. Running Hawk's hand rested on the butt of the old Leva action, rifle he'd taken from a fallen soldier at Red Mesa. years ago. His other hand gripped the knife that had seen more battles than some men had years. His face was calm, but his body was coiled tight, like a mountain lion ready to spring. The woman shifted. "They'll kill you." He didn't turn. "They will try." From below came the sharp crack of a rifle, a warning shot. A bullet sparked off the stone inches from his boot. The leader, a thick-shouldered officer with a white beard, shouted up the bluff, "Running Hawk! Hand her over and you can walk away alive." The warrior's reply was a deep, steady voice that carried down the walls. "She is mine to guard. If you come, you will not leave." The officer laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You can't hold us all off." "Running." Hawk set the rifle stock against his shoulder. "I only need to hold long enough." Then the pass exploded into gunfire. Dust and rock chips danced around them as the first volley came. Running Hawk fired once, and a man tumbled from his horse. He moved like the desert wind, low, fast, and lethal, sliding behind boulders, returning. Fire with deadly precision. The woman flinched with each shot, but she never took her eyes off him. She had been his prisoner, but here, in this moment, she saw a man who stood alone against the world for a cause she couldn't yet name. The attackers spread out, climbing the narrow switchbacks. Running Hawk's rifle clicked empty. He slung it aside and drew the blade, a wicked edge of steel that caught the morning light. Two men reached the ledge. The first lunged, and Running Hawk met him with a slash across the forearm, spinning and driving the man into the cliff face. The second swung his rifle like a club, but Running Hawk stepped in close, driving his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him sprawling over the edge. From below, the officer shouted for them to press harder. More men climbed. Running Hawk's breath came in sharp bursts now. Blood streaked his ribs from a grazing bullet. His muscles screamed from the night's escape, but his stance never wavered. Another came at him, this one faster, smarter. They grappled, boots sliding on loose gravel. The warrior's knife hand was caught, twisted. With a roar, he broke free, drove his knee into the man's gut, and finished him with a brutal punch that cracked bone. The woman screamed. The shadow had fallen across her. One of the attackers had slipped past him. Running Hawk turned too late until the woman herself snatched up a fallen pistol and fired. The man dropped at her feet, surprise frozen on his face. The fight paused. The officer below had seen enough. He cursed, pulled his men back, and the remaining riders retreated into the canyon's haze. The echo of their retreat faded into silence. Running Hawk stood still, chest heaving, blood dripping onto the stone. The woman looked at him, the pistol still shaking in her grip. "You could have left me," she said softly. He met her gaze. Eyes unreadable. "I do not leave what I guard." The sun rose higher, bathing Shadow Bluff in gold, but the world below still waited, full of enemies and battles yet to come. For now they lived, and that was enough.